Welcome back from lunch, everyone. If you're just joining us, my name is Dr. Julie Nyberg, and I serve as the Executive Director for the California Association for the Gifted.
Hi there. My name is Gary Saunders. I serve as the Parent Representative Chair for the California Association for the Gifted.
Feel free to share or ask any questions during this session using the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen, or you can also join us in the chat.
And you can support CAG by becoming a member today as an individual or a school site. Sign up at www.cagifted.org by clicking on membership. This session will last from 1 o'clock to 1:50 p.m. and the next session will begin at 2 o'clock p.m. using the same link you used to log into this session.
I have the honor of introducing Thomas Woods. Thomas, also known as Tommy, is a third grade teacher at Sherman Oaks Elementary Charter in Los Angeles Unified School District. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in accounting from the University of Texas at Austin and previously worked in public accounting and consulting. Discovering a passion for education, he earned his Master's of Arts in Teaching from the University of Southern California. Thomas now enjoys inspiring young learners daily. He lives in Sherman Oaks with his fiancee, Katie, and their two mischievous dogs. Welcome, Thomas.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure everything is working. Awesome. Okay. Thank you guys so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conference so far. I've been learning so much. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And let's see. Are we able to see the screen?
All good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm here to talk about integrating math across the curriculum and the idea that math isn't just for math time. The things that I'm going to cover here, so we're going to start with an opening activity. I'll talk about the benefits of math integration across the curriculum. Piece on differentiation, specifically the spillover effect. Talk a little bit about scholar traits, which I'm really glad that Kristen Day was able to go over earlier today. The idea of universal concepts and how adding a universal concept, an overarching theme, can really help with the integration of math. My big piece will be here on the integration and practice, so showing how we can put these ideas into practice. Again, these are going to be examples from my classroom. We don't necessarily have to copy everything, but what I'm hoping for is that I get you curious and thinking and asking questions and bringing those ideas back into the classroom. And if I'm able to do a little bit of that, then I'll feel like I'm successful. And then at the very end, I do want to just touch on, I know, the concerns that we might have. We only have so many minutes and hours in a day. And just, addressing that, of course, we don't have to hit every standard. We don't have to add math all of the time, but just exposing our students a little bit at a time can really help enhance that understanding. And then how can we communicate these ideas to our school site, but also to our parents? Thank you, Julia, for that amazing introduction. Just something that I would like to share here is I did get my gifted education certification under the amazing tutelage of Dr. Sandra Kaplan. So a lot of the strategies that I will be going over have come from her and a lot of my studies at the University of Southern California. I'm currently I'll be going into teaching second grade this next year. I have been a third grade teacher. So a lot of the ideas that I am sharing are going to be focused on elementary age students, but please know that the inquisitiveness and the questioning and the strategies that I have kind of implemented in the classroom that I'm sharing can be used across the spectrum of students, right? regardless of label, of grade, of perceived ability. So I would like to start off with this idea of reading beyond words, that we can actually use the literacy skills that we develop in language arts to really understand the world around us. You know, deducing, inferring, comparing, cause and effect. These are all things that we don't necessarily have to do just with words. So this is an activity I like to start off the school year with my students. And I'll ask you, and you guys can answer in the chat, but where can you read or see or use math outside of the classroom, outside of kind of our traditional math time? And if you guys would like to go ahead and maybe put some suggestions in the chat, that would be awesome, just to get our ideas. Yeah, cooking, a huge one, right? Especially when we start talking about fractions. I love that. Yeah, buildings, skyscrapers, architecture, totally. Yeah, sewing, yeah, crafting. I love that. Money is a big one. Yes, splitting a check. Yeah, organization, huge, right? And normally I would give a lot of kind of wait time and discussion around this, but looks like you guys have a lot of the same ideas that that my students bring up. So let me make sure. Okay, so I go into this idea of, yeah, Legos is a great one. Oh, I love these ideas. Yeah, music and art, card games. So this idea that math is something that we bring with us all the time, right? When we're shopping, we have quantities and prices. When you're traveling, you have to know when a flight arrives or departs. What number is my baggage claim? We talk about architecture, right? The number of floors in a skyscraper, the button I have to push on an elevator, right? Time defines our life all the time. When I have to get to school, when do I leave? When is that bell gonna ring? Right? The grades on a report card or an assessment, and what does that really tell me? Right? Maybe about my learning. Sports is huge, right? The speed of a pitch or the angle of a shot, right? And then cooking is huge, right? But from fractions to quantities, and something that I really like to get my kids thinking about beyond the maybe our traditional mathematical senses. We even read the frown lines on our mom's face when we spill the glass of milk for the third time, right? We can kind of interpret, well, how angry is she, right? Or how frustrated. So we really do bring math with us all the time, and helping students see that. So the key question that I want to talk about today is this idea. Oh, I like that, Gary, counting my steps. That's great. Is the idea that we can, by integrating math throughout the day and throughout subject areas, we can actually enhance the understanding and the relevancy of math. But not only that, how do we excite and challenge our students by making math real world applicable, but also contextual to the individual, to make it personalized, to make that connection for a student? And so I kind of want to start out here by talking about, the reasons of why we should integrate math. And a lot of this we've probably thought about. And again, I don't want this to be overwhelming. I'm not saying we're hitting every math standard every time we touch social studies. It's just infusing it a little bit at a time. Well, we're able to make it real world applicable, right? Math is everywhere, everywhere. And I want to make sure that we can get students to see that math isn't contained in this formulaic or technical bubble that we call math time that happens right before recess. Math is so much more than that. Just as we were talking on the chat, from sewing to cooking to traveling to the number of likes on a YouTube or TikTok video, right? Math is infused in all of those areas. And that it's a tool that we carry with us in our pocket all the time. We don't set that down when we go out to recess or when we end the day, right? So really helping students recognize math in authentic situations so that because it helps them, it prepares them for life, right? We use math everywhere. Um, and contextual learning, what I mean by that is making it contextual to the individual. So we can help students make connections to their own lived experiences, prior knowledge. And in this way, math can and should be culturally responsive, right? To the individual. And these are those conversations we want students to bring home with them. What, talking to their family members. Well, how do you use math? How do I use math in the home, in my life, with my family? And the idea here is that by making math relevant, we're increasing engagement and motivation for all students. It doesn't matter their perceived ability level or anything. And I think one of the main reasons why we're here is how can integrating math develop those higher order thinking skills, right? From problem solving to the problems that we see at school on a daily level, like how do we reduce trash or increase recycling, right? um, Analytical reasoning. When I think of Dr. Kaplan, she loves the westward movement, and I think about, when you're in social studies, infusing those questions, given that a family has 100 pounds of food and 7 family members and X supplies, like how many days before winter do they need to leave to be successful, to make it west, right? And the idea here is that they're open-ended. We don't need to necessarily get to a defined correct answer. It's the journey of math. It's the discovering that's important. A lot of times with these questions that I pose to my students, I don't necessarily have an answer. I want to see how do they go about thinking or problem solving, right? Again, it's there's so many pathways that math can take you, and sometimes there isn't even an endpoint that we all have to agree on, right? And showing that. So, I want to touch on differentiation before I go into like practical application. But something we all have to consider is that not all gifted students, not all students are the same, right? Knowing that there's a spectrum of understanding. Some students are going to be strong in some areas. Some students might not feel that way, and kind of showing up with um, an environment that fosters like a growth mindset, right? That it's okay if you don't know everything. That's why we're here, right? This idea that we're developing all scholars, that yes, we have you know maybe challenging strategies, but that we offer it to all students. And this idea of a spillover effect, right? That by providing students all of these strategies that might be quote unquote gifted strategies, that every student has the opportunity to show their ability. um, this allows us as teachers to teach without assumptions, right? We're able to differentiate, obviously, to the needs, abilities, and the interests of our students, but it also allows us an opportunity to identify those students that might not have been identified. A lot of these questioning and inquisitive strategies can really help you as a teacher see the ability in all students. And that idea that there's a spectrum of engagement, achievement, understanding. Some students might be more engaged than others in a particular subject, and knowing that by kind of integrating math in different areas, you might get more engagement from certain students. And that idea that, like, okay, we might be offering challenging strategies. Yeah, some students are going to get this much. Some students might only get this much, but that piece is still valuable, right? They've had the opportunity to engage in it, and they're brought into that environment. So I really do like to acknowledge that we have to kind of teach without boundaries. Here we go. So I love that so many of us presenters kind of have a similar ideology with a lot of this. And again, I'm going to give a shout out to the previous speakers, Jennifer Crow and Kristen Day, for talking about this, but the idea of traits of a scholar and getting the students to participate in this. Yes, these are traits that we might look for giftedness, right? That sometimes we're provided at a school site or at a district level. And sometimes we never give this back to the students, showing them the traits that we are looking for in lifetime learners, right? And to help them be reflective of themselves on these traits. Well, to have perseverance, to take those risks, to view practice as not as a good thing, right? To be precise with goal setting, this thirst for knowledge, as Kristen had said, always asking why. This idea that we give time for kids to ponder and wonder and ask questions, engagement, right? How can we get students to be more willing to participate, and foster that curiosity? And this is actually a sheet of paper that I provide to my students and parents at the very beginning of the year. This is something we start the year off, showing them that every student can show these traits in some form or another. Again, the idea of a spectrum, but that we can all engage. And what I thought was really interesting when I was talking about math is we all have to apply these mathematical practice standards in our classroom. And sometimes I think we leave these practices, again, at the door when we leave math class. But what's so interesting, as I was kind of going through this with this last year, is that a lot of these mathematical practice standards transcend math, right? So when we're looking for opportunities to informally or formally assess our students on some of these standards, we can add mathematical elements into other areas to actually foster and look for these practice standards. So obviously perseverance is a big one that we teach students throughout the school day, right? This idea of like problem solving and persevering through a problem to solve doesn't just stop at math class, right? And then so construct arguments. When we talk about giftedness, we're always talking about how can you see multiple perspectives? How can you relate yourself to others? And it's so important in math, right? How can we use math to collaborate, to converse, to debate, to argue, right? And it kind of comes to that art of argumentation. Practice, to be able to use models and tools appropriately. It doesn't matter how smart or gifted you are, like all of us have to practice that to get better. The idea of setting a goal whenever we're problem solving, we need to make sure we attend to this precision, that we're hitting our goal accurately. And I think my favorite of all of these standards is number 8: look for express regularity and repeated reasoning. How do I take that? Well, I take it as, how does a student use the known to understand the unknown, right? How can they use their reasoning or the patterns that they've seen to understand something that they might not have seen before? And yeah, you see this in math, but all subject areas. So this idea of really utilizing prior knowledge of students. So again, when we're filling out those report cards and we're looking at these standards of mathematical practice, I just want us to really have that idea that it really transcends math. Quickly want to talk about it, this idea of a universal concept. You're going to hear it, I'm sure, throughout these 3 days of training, but it's an idea that an overarching idea that allows students to make connections or relationships across disciplines and areas. So by setting something like this up at the beginning of the year, you are able to it's another platform for students to be able to make those connections. And there are a lot of different forms of these concepts. You can talk about force, relationships, power. An example that I've used this last year was the example of change, right? How In language arts, characters change over time. In science, there are different states of water, right, throughout this water cycle. Social studies, that inventions change the way we live. In math, we talked about, we didn't get super technical algebraic, but the idea that there are rates of change when factors, change. Does it have an effect on other things? Music, and some people had added this to the chat, but the idea of like changing keys, right, or the change of beats. Art, the change of techniques. And then sports, we love the changing of rules. I had a lot of baseball aficionados in my third grade class last year talking about the changing in rules over the last few years. So it's really important that we have something that can kind of anchor all of our integration. So I'll talk a little bit about this at the end too, about how we can potentially push this at a school level, school-wide level. So really quickly, I want to ask you a question here. So sometimes I like to pose a question before we, or maybe after we read a story. So we talked about Cinderella, folk tales, fairy tales in third grade. We read the story, talked about some sequencing, some stuff on the language arts side. And then I like to challenge my students, okay, where can you find the math in the story of Cinderella? So I'll give you a few seconds to maybe answer in the chat. But what are some ideas that you might have? Where can you find math in the story of Cinderella? Time is huge, huge. Time management. And I put some of the prompts on the side because I like to I do a lesson at the beginning of the year teaching them these prompts, but always kind of integrating them and giving them ideas on how they might use it. What are some details of that relate to math? Are there any questions that you have related to math? Things like that. Yeah, pumpkins, mice, shoe size, awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and I would give students a little bit more time, but I want to make sure I get through my examples here. And this is where I'm going to start giving you some examples that I've used practically in class. I'm going to talk about our Cinderella here, which is and again, the onus isn't on you in when you're asking these questions. It's really on the students to explore. And this is where I like to offer some differentiation strategies, whether I have students work in groups, whether they want to work alone, whether I bring up some students to help with maybe with your English learners, you give them some sentence starters. But I love it. Time management, right? If a ball starts at 8 p.m. and it takes me 30 minutes to get home and I got to be home by midnight, like when do I leave, right? Time spent on chores. When we talk about measurement, I saw people talking the glass slipper, right? Like if you're a cop, like you've got to know your sizes, right? And somebody mentioned the mice and the pumpkin. Well, there's a pattern of threes my students notice a lot of times in fairy tales, right? I'm pretty sure she has to go to the ball and she was denied 3 times. There were kind of 3 different transformations that happened. And then, of course, like sequencing in a story, geometry, the shape of the carriage. Somebody mentioned scale, right? Which you can actually bring like multiplication into the story of Cinderella. And I love this idea of thinking like a disciplinarian. So actually bringing in an occupation or area of study to help students be more engaged in a specific story, but thinking kind of outside the box. So yeah, I like the chimes counted towards midnight. That's fun. Yeah. I appreciate this is great information you're sharing. But the idea that if you're a fashion designer, you got to use math. And I know that there are always kids sitting in there that want to become designers. Great path, right? But to help them notice that math isn't intimidating or scary. We don't have to be masters at it to really understand that it's all around us. When you're a fashion designer, you got to know measurement. If you're designing shoes, shoe size, sequencing, ordering, all of these things. Again, I like to use the 3 little pigs, from the very beginning at a little age, kindergarten, you can use counting and cardinality and sequencing, right? Again, there's that pattern of three houses, three pigs. How many? You can even bring in the idea that math is related to language, right? How many times does the wolf say "I'll huff" and "I'll puff"? Right? There's almost even a cadence to it, right? The idea of measurement and geometry. Well, like, how are these houses shaped? Does it matter that they chose to make them in squares versus circles? I don't know. Area and perimeter. One of my favorites, and this is probably for a little higher of a grade level, is you can actually bring in experimentation, right? Give students popsicle sticks and paper and make two different types of houses, right? And record, does the force have to be stronger or forceful or whatever to be able to knock down a certain house? And again, I want to stress that some of this integration doesn't, it can be on that Friday afternoon when you're giving time for students to have some free time or free play, because what I'm hoping for is that these are some fun activities that allow us to bridge math with other things, and we're not necessarily looking for a formal assessment. And then, of course, you can think like a disciplinarian, of an architect. Where can you bring some of those mathematical language, angles and geometrical shapes into it, right? A book, and again, these are stories that I've read in my class, so you can apply this to anything. But there's a great book called Because of Mr. Trupt. Rod Bouillet, I think, is the author. But it's about a teacher, first year teaching. There's a little mishap that happens, and the seven students that are in a class have to kind of come together and problem solve, right? But it's a character study. You're following these seven characters over time. In and of it, that itself is a mathematical principle, right? That things happen over time, that change happens. And again, here's that connection to the universal principle. But what's really interesting is I love the thought experiments that we can have with math. Again, this idea that it's open-ended, that we don't need to get to a specific answer. Oh, I love that. Math and geography, Hansel and Gretel, Goldilocks. I love it. Geocaching. No, but totally. And that's where I want you to be playful. The idea that math is completely structured and formulaic and technical is not true. We can be super playful with math. So one of the activities that the teacher does in this book called Because of Mr. Trupt is he takes the kids out to the soccer field at school, right? And he poses the question, how many blades of grass are in this soccer? It's a full-size soccer field, right? The kids are going, I don't know. It's a ridiculous question. Why are you asking me? Some of the kids are sitting there going, like, what? I'm gonna count every blade of grass here? And the idea is that they have to get an estimation, a prediction of how many blades of grass there are, right? And he didn't give them much direction, right? He paired them in some groups, and it was basically like, well, go figure it out. And we did a similar, my grade level and I did a similar activity. And it was so interesting to see how the different groups responded to this open-ended question, right? I had students getting rulers. I had students getting lengths of string, and then counting in like a foot square, and then multiplying that by. But again, it's not the correct answer. I don't care what the answer is of how many blades of grass are in this field. It's the idea that they're applying a lot of these skills that we learn in math to estimate, right? And to be playful. And then we did another experiment where we had students basically at home bring in different things that they would think that had to be other than water, that they think that might help plants grow. And I will tell you that if you do this, and it is open-ended, do the experiment outside, because after about a week, it was It was nasty, but it was really interesting to see and have these students. Obviously, we're measuring every day and the quantity and how tall the grass grew, right? But this idea of like exploration and reflective writing, like there wasn't. We just wanted to explore what would happen, right? So, which has been interesting. But again, it's the exploration and the playfulness. So I want to ask this again. I'm going to be less structured this time. Okay. I am going to say, now, where can you find math in science? Maybe think about a science standard that's specific to what you're teaching. Maybe if you're like, I don't really teach science, well, maybe how can you incorporate math and science to something that you do in language arts, right? Or in social studies. But this idea that think outside the box, be creative here. I don't care if you think you're wrong. These are the types of things that I always have the conversation with my students before I have an activity. That it isn't about the destination, it's about the route, and we all can take different routes to get there. So science, and again, I like to offer these prompts. So maybe math can relate to science and change over time, or how can impact affect science? Maybe there's a mathematical element about that. Oh, just muted myself. Sorry. Oh, I lost the chat. Hold on, give me 1 second. Okay. Yeah, measurements and formulas, totally. When we're talking about chemistry, it's going to be very important that we bring math into play. Periodic table, totally. And if you start to talk about like the idea of an array in math, well, when you look at a periodic table, even just the setup is somewhat of an array. You got columns and rows, and what does the location of that element on the periodic table mean? Why was it put there? Why wasn't it at the top left, right? Temperature, totally. Yeah, plant rotations, revolutions. And I think one thing that I love to make a push for is this idea of like geometry. I don't think we use that language enough. So I love that. Yeah, trends over time using data, totally. So I know there's a lot of ideas. So I want to talk about something that I love to look for is math in nature. Science isn't just nature, but something that I really like to look for is this idea that when you go outside, you are encountering math. So really quickly, I know this might look a little technical. I want to say something. I am no expert in the Fibonacci sequence. I'll give you a little explanation of what this means, but nor am I a master in calculus and upper algebraic thinking. This idea came about because of a question a student had about why are there a certain number of petals on this flower versus the number of petals on this flower. And it also got us thinking about the idea of like, why is a four-leaf clover rare, right? And of course, as a lifelong learner myself, I went down that kind of that rabbit hole of exploration. And it got me really thinking, how can I bring something like this into a classroom for second and third graders? So the Fibonacci sequence is this sequence of numbers that you will find all over nature. And me and my third graders figured this out just by observation, that first step in the scientific process, right? We, having taken a look at this, and so a number in this sequence is the sum of the two preceding numbers. So if you were to look at this orange box here, 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. And so on. And it goes on forever, right? What is really interesting is that if you were to map this out in 2 dimensions, it would actually create this spiral. But what is so fascinating is that this spiraled sequence is seen everywhere in nature, from the flowers on a petal, the leaves on a branch, the branches on a tree, to the number of stars in our galaxy. And I do not know all the specifics of this, and scientists are still trying to figure out kind of the mysteries of this sequence and these numbers. But you don't have to be an expert in math or science to appreciate the mystery, the beauty in math and how it's all around us. And we were taking a look. Oh my God, when I go look, and please, after these conferences, go look outside when you're on a nature walk. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, but most of the time, when you look at leaves or petals on a flower, you're going to find them in this sequence, right? Numbers on this sequence. Now, yes, there is a why to why this sequence occurs in nature. It's efficiency, right? Plants are able to get the most efficient amount of sunlight when they're in this sequence. But I don't even necessarily care about the why. It's great to share that with your students. It's awesome. But I want students to understand that the math is even there in the first place, right? And then using this, and you can notice that, like, in succulents, in sunflowers, in the tails of chameleons, I mean, it is everywhere. And just helping students understand that. And then this is a great activity to you can, from kindergartners all the way through, seniors in high school, but doing a nature walk, right? How are you able to see this sequence or these numbers in the real world? And what is so interesting is, after kind of going through this, well, why might you not find a four-leaf clover? Well, it doesn't follow into this sequence. And then having that discussion maybe with older students, or pushing that kind of depth with students. And why does that not show up? Well, it's not efficient, right? It's actually a variation in nature, which is pretty interesting. But again, it's going in and having those deeper, playful discussions with your students. Oh, sorry, let me go back here. Something else that I love to talk with my students about is this idea of biomimicry. You're copying nature to develop solutions to problems, right? It's a great area to include thinking like a disciplinarian of an engineer, right? So, using that idea that, okay, a bullet train was actually developed. The original idea wasn't human made, right? We copied nature. It was the aerodynamics, actually the hydrodynamics of a kingfisher that gave us the design for a bullet train. The fin of a whale helped us design how aerodynamic, how efficient a wind turbine blade is, right? So, giving an open-ended question or activity, like, what could you let's think about a problem, right, that we might have in the classroom, in society, in your own life, right? You need help doing a chore, right? What adaptation from an animal that we've been learning, right? Or maybe give them a list, or maybe a website that has amazing adaptations. How can you use that adaptation to solve a problem? And again, I'll go down to the bottom here with these creativity skills. But this is such a good way to introduce, add to, modify, replace, substitute, combined, and give students the ability to tinker. I learned this one from Dr. Kaplan, but this idea of learning through like physical manual activities to promote the creative process. We've done one with paper airplanes, and how can you tinker with a paper airplane using the science or the physics behind a different bird wings, right? And then you can really have that discussion of angles. Well, the eagle wings have a sharper angle than the dove, which maybe I will change the wings or cut the wings on my airplane to mimic mimic the wings of this bird, and how does it change? How does it affect the flying of my paper airplane? Which is fascinating. And then, obviously you can add math into how you record the data and how you compare the data. So I want to talk a little bit about social studies here. So, of course, on the nose, when we think of social studies, we think of timelines, graphs, maps, when we want to relate it to math. And yes, that is great to do. It's a great way to add measurement and data standards into practice, right? So that you can use what you're doing in other subjects to reinforce those standards that you're learning in math. But what I like to encourage more of is the actual creation of the graphs and the data plots using data that you might find historically or contemporarily in your social studies time. But and give them a little bit of voice and choice on what they want to research, right? How can you use numbers to delve deeper? How do numbers help you? How does math help you with research, right? Helping timeline the events in a person's life. Well, you have five plots on your timeline. What's going to be most important? Why? Like kind of rationalizing what makes these events most important to you or to that person, right? Using operations to solve contextual word problems, just making it personalized, right? Anytime that you are showing a word problem for a given operation in math class, why don't you tweak that problem just to incorporate some language that you're learning in something else? I love the idea of prediction and estimation. It goes back to that. Remember when I was talking about you just going outside and counting the blades of grass, well, estimating the blades of grass. I don't want people counting. Hopefully you're using some strategy, but the same idea, it's that idea of like, you have X amount of supplies. Can you make it west if you only have 100 days left until winter? Well, if a candy bar today is $1 and and it was 10 cents in 1965, like, what is the inflation? Why does it do that, right? Maybe you can better connect with your parents when you go to the grocery store and they're like, well, man, it wasn't this high when I was a kid, because sometimes you might be sitting there going like, well, a candy bar is always $1. Understanding that things change, right? So another great way, and you've heard, I'm sure, Kristen did a good job, and Dr. Sandra Kaplan will be talking about these prompts of depth and complexity. Jennifer introduced them too, but it's a great way to frame social studies and integrate math. So you can examine trends over time. We were talking about fashion and how our school turned 100, so we were looking a lot of things over 100 years, and we were looking at trends in fashion. And one of my students noticed that, well, things were a lot more symmetrical in the 1920s, right? And things got a little more asymmetrical. Well, what was the reasoning behind that? And again, we don't necessarily need to have the answers, but it's that thinking piece. Calculate changes over time, right? And big one, you might think of the stock market. Especially when you're working with older kids, or how historical figures changed over time. Observe patterns, right? I always like to think of like the civil rights movement, and how can we add math to observe those patterns? And you can bring ethics into it, right? Were those changes ethical? Were some of the things that were happening before not ethical? And then a big one is prove with mathematical evidence. We live in a world today where proof is really important. Statistics and math and numbers do not necessarily prove that something is true. Truth and proof, we have to be careful. We have to teach our students the nuances of this, right? That statistics and math can help us prove that, but that we really have to be in depth in looking at the truth behind it, right? And impact. I'm thinking about the fires in Los Angeles. Maybe how do you calculate the damage that's done? Not just in dollars. How might you calculate it in the emotional damage or the psychological damage, right? And using these prompts to understand how to argue, right? And debate. Okay. Oh, I had my picture of Oregon Trail because I always say, gamify it. If you can find a way to gamify any of these subjects and adding math, it's a great way to do it. When I was a kid, 90s, early 2000s, there was this 8-bit game, Oregon Trail, and it was all about could you get your family safely across through the West, given all these constraints. They actually have card games like this now, or push your kids to maybe make a game related to this. So where can you find math and music? I know I want to ask you this question, but I'm worried I'm not going to have enough time here. So there are so many different pathways that we can go with this. Obviously, music, we have patterns, beats. This is a great way to incorporate fractions when you're talking about beats and measures. You use fractional units to describe these, right? The idea of tempo and dynamics, the loudness, the intensity of stuff, and even if you're just using words like increase, reduce, at least you're getting some of this mathematical language outside of math time. Same with art, you have shapes and symmetry. I love using the Mondrian art here as a guy who uses primary colors, white and black, to make shapes using rectangles. Computer activity, which is great, is to use Google Sheets and make Mondrian art. Not only does it help develop geometry, but those 21st century skills. Area and perimeter, I think of negative space. How much space does something take up? How much space does it not take up? And then somebody had mentioned earlier about scale. It's a great way to talk about scale. You can incorporate division, multiplication into art, which is great. And then I love talking about having thought experiments with sports, and you can have this in a lot of categories. But I am a sports person, so but rules. Why is there a clock in sports? What if we remove the clock from sports? What would happen? What happens if you play kickball and there are 2 balls instead of 1 ball? How does that change the sport? Dimensions. A coworker of mine, when we first teach baseball or softball, she changes the bat to one of those giant like water cooler jugs, right? Why do you think she does that? What is it going to make it more likely to hit the ball? Less likely? Are more children going to be involved in the activity? So again, it's these thought experiments that would happen. So just bringing a little bit of that into play. I have a small business project-based learning where students created a small business. I can share this presentation afterwards. It'll give a little bit of information, but I do want to touch on 2 things before I leave here. Some of the concerns. We don't have to do it all, right? We only have so much time in a day. So don't try everything. When I say integrate math, start with 1 or 2 extensions that you can do, right? But the idea here is the more that students get exposed to it, the better that they are going to make connections in the future. Prioritize your alignment, right? If you are doing a cause and effect language arts lesson, make sure that the standards and learning objectives are clear and that subject is prioritized. Doesn't mean that you can't bring in some math through questioning and inquisitiveness. And then just another push that math integration is beneficial. In my class, I've seen increased understanding, retention, and motivation. When they realize that math isn't just in this math time, they're like, oh yeah, I like math, right? Foster that curiosity. And then you're better able to differentiate for all students. And then one thing I'd like to touch on is, how do I communicate this idea to the school and the parents? One of the biggest benefits, or one of the biggest pushes I'm going to make, is to have the communication with the school about universal concepts and prompts of depth and complexity. If your school or your grade level can have a concept for that year, whether it be change or force or relationship, and maybe the whole school does it and it changes the next year, then students are going to have the opportunity to understand all of these concepts through their journey in that school. But it also, if you're a fifth grade teacher and you're teaching these prompts of depth and complexity or these universal concepts, you have students already making connections on day one, right? You're not having to start over from scratch, right? Again, how can you relate math to the school environment? Teaching students to have those conversations about math. When you go to see the school nurse, like, why don't you ask them how math is involved? Where can we find math in the library, on the playground? And then for parents, making sure that we provide them a roadmap, which a lot of us do, just showing what we're learning in school, in math, right? Giving them prompts and questions that you use in the classroom. Where is math found at home? When should we start dinner if we eat at 7 p.m., right? How is math related to all the video games that you play on a daily basis or on a weekly basis? And then we just traveled. How did math come into play on our family trip? And again, sharing with parents the prompts of depth and complexity and the universal concept I think is very beneficial. So I know I'm out of time, but something that I want you to leave with here is, where might you to start to integrate math in the upcoming school year? Again, I don't want this to be a laborious process. I want you to choose one subject or one area that you can push a little bit more math into, and take it from there, right? Hopefully I got you curious and thinking and inquisitive, because that is kind of my goal here. I want you to be creative with math. What I really want and I hope for is that math doesn't become an intimidating technical formulaic place. It becomes creative and natural, and that we see it all around us, that it's a tool, that it's a language. So with that, I just want to really appreciate all your participation. If you have any questions, sorry, right here. I'm Tommy Woods. That's my email. I will provide this to Julia and everybody. That would be great, so I can get this presentation over. I see somebody, yes, reflection. I mean, math is a great way to have reflection on for students. But anyway, again, thank you so much. I will make sure I can get this over to you guys, and feel free to ask me any questions that you have. So
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for attending this webinar session, to all of you who are attending, again, featuring Thomas Woods. So by incorporating these strategies into your practice, you directly impact the structure of gifted education in California or in your respective location worldwide. Your certificate of completion will be emailed to you 1 week after the last day of this event. And the next session will begin at 2 o'clock using the same link you used to log in to this session. So you can remain in this room and you will be carried into the next session.
All right. Thank you. Take care.